Awaken Hardest Podcast with John White.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Season 2 of the Awaken Hardest Podcast. I am your host, John White, the Awaken Hardest. This episode is titled Accomplishments and Growth. As I mentioned in the last episode, I wanted to, before I jumped into the grief series, or basically the theme of this entire season being grief, I wanted to hit on my 2022 and the accomplishments that I've made up until this point, which also plays into the grief series as well, hoping to give a little context to who I am and what has gone on over the past 7 years for me, my development through death, overcoming mass changes in my life, basically giving you a where I was to where I am and some context to who I am. So let's jump right in. As I mentioned in the last episode, I look at, or I use the seasons as a metaphor for this cyclical change that I go through or have been going through, and intend on it continuing until the end of my life. I'm a firm believer in going with change, and with change happening constantly in the world we live in, there's no sense in resisting it. In a sense, you have to discover what that change or how that change affects you and how you are changing. I look at winter as a time of going within, letting go of what's old, that part dying off and bringing in the new. Spring being a new beginning, summer being about learning to implement new parts from that new beginning, and then fall is the harvest. It's enjoying the new before going back to reflecting in the wintertime. In 2015, I started a journey or an awakening to my true self. I wasn't happy. I wasn't comfortable. I was putting on a show for everyone around me, lying to myself about who I was, but deep inside knowing in key moments, like, this is not who you are, and then being afraid of what that would look like. I was also depressed and angry, completely out of balance. And I look back on it now. I didn't know what balance even meant back then, but 2015, that was basically the year of recognizing what made me unhappy, what I wanted to change. At that point, I started to become a hermit. I was so confused with where or how I was going to discover who I truly am and learn how to implement that into my life and show it to the world. It terrified me, but I knew it needed to happen because I guess I could say now, I was looking at it intuitively, or I felt it intuitively. And 2016 is when the change started to come. Spirituality was so huge to me. I had a reading, if you've read any of my blogs, and I believe I may have mentioned this in a podcast before, but I had a reading that changed everything for me. As much as I doubted any kind of God at that point in time, I was an atheist. I got a reading, and my grandmother, who I lost when I was 12, someone extremely important to me, came through with a message and a couple messages that were no way that anybody else knew. And that gave me hope. It gave me a little more purpose in realizing that at the end of this life, it's not just the end. So that hope turned into motivation. And from there, I really started to pay attention to some of these things. And there was messages that were coming through in these readings from loved ones that had passed on about things that were unbalancing me. And I started to pay attention to that. One of the main things being I was so uberly masculine. I wasn't in touch with any of the feminine parts of me or the feminine energy within me. I was completely out of that. That was something I looked at as a weakness. I'm a man. I'm supposed to be masculine. That's how I was brought up. And that was the beginning point of trying to learn how to change that. And creativity became a big part of that. And it is basically a theme throughout this. Hence the Awakened Artist. And that name also comes from one of my biggest challenges at the time was I had built up all of these walls, these defensive walls that were there to protect me from being hurt, not allowing me to truly love anyone, because at that point in time, I believed that if you love someone so much, it's going to hurt even more if and when you lose them, because I had experienced so much death up until this point. But I needed to break those walls down. Again, where the name Awakened Artist comes from. And through the creativity, primarily gardening was the main thing at first. It was a way of me accessing a part of myself that I hadn't before. It was my form of meditation. And over the years, the gardening would progress from house plants to growing vegetables outside, understanding soil composition and composting, to growing herbs, air plants, succulents, and most recently, flowers. And that has been so important and vital to who I am. In 2017, I started to learn about balancing the energies of daily life and the energy that I put out. I also continued to understand and develop my spirituality. And that year, if there was a theme that year, it was truly waking up. It became probably the most difficult year of my life. Well, the beginning. I can't even say a year because there's like time period here. At the beginning of 2017, in January, my dad, out of the blue, had got a gallstone stuck in his bile duct, which blocked off his pancreas. And the bile had built up inside of the pancreas, causing necrosis in the pancreas. And he basically had around an 8 to 10% chance of living, so they had to induce a coma. And at the time, he was only 61 years old. We watched my dad for the next 3-4 months in ICU struggle to live. Every time they had to do surgery, which was like twice a week, they had to do a major surgery on him. We had to say goodbye, thinking that that was it, because the chances were so slim. But he ended up making it through it all. 5 months later, somehow survived through this entire thing, which would ultimately become the reason he ended up passing in 2020. Right after that, I think he had just got out of ICU and into a care facility. I was arrested for possession of cocaine. I was facing a felony charge and got that dropped down to a misdemeanor, luckily. But that was very eye-opening. A couple months after that, my partner, my kid's mom, we separated. Not exactly on my terms, more her decision. And it was a bit shocking. So that was a very difficult year. But it was very necessary because, like I said, it was my wake-up year. That was definitely the theme of 2017. Moving into 2018, my spiritual beliefs and practices continued to develop and became a very focal point of my life. implementing creativity into my daily life became a priority. I noticed how much it was helping me. This year is when I discovered how important painting was to me and how beneficial of a creative outlet it was, or it is for me. Self-expression that I was getting out of painting was something that I'd never experienced before in my life. I had built a couple bookshelves or random things for around the house, but never had truly created things that were expressing how I felt. And that was completely new to me. And at this time, I'm 38 years old, so it took me quite a while to figure all this out. But the most impactful moment of 2018 came in June when my mom suddenly had passed. That pretty much rocked my world. I mean, it really did. After 2017, with my dad being in ICU, being arrested, the end of my relationship with my partner, this one just fucking punched me right in the stomach. And the hardest I've ever been punched. It changed me forever. And here's another reason why I'm doing this podcast, actually, or doing this series around grief, because she is my mom. And that feeling of losing someone who, growing up with my mom and my dad wasn't around as much, so it was me and my mom. I was the oldest of 5, and it was her and I quite a bit. And no matter what your relationship is with your mom, it's still your mom. She brought you into the world, and losing her at the age of 38 was just devastating. It was way too young. She was only 57 years old. And that broke my heart. Moving into 2019, grief obviously was at the forefront. This is when I really started to understand grief and grieving in that process and implementing it into my life a lot more than I had before. On the brighter side, I fell in love with someone, and she definitely brought a brightness to the darkness that surrounded me. I also quit smoking after 25 years of smoking. That was very difficult and brought a sense of confidence and pride in me. Around this time, my creativity is just pouring out of me. I have all these different creative outlets and things I'm trying to experiment with. I have a whole closet almost full now of different creative outlets, from yarn to wood carving. So many different ways of experimenting and trying to see what I'm good at, I guess. Then 2020 comes, and we all know about 2020, the fucking COVID year. That brought all kinds of change, as I'm sure it did for everyone else. It definitely did for me, paying attention to my health, how it impacted my business. I realized the importance of socializing. That was such a major part for me, being trapped inside. But it also bred new business ideas, forced me to take my creative outlets and see how I could implement them into some kind of new business, doing something that I really love to do. I also realized that balance, or how to implement balance, and making it more of a focal point in my life, taking all of these new parts of me and implementing into my daily life, my time with my kids, my business, time to myself, time with my girlfriend, all of these things, learning to balance them out. And I guess looking back on COVID, the biggest thing I got out of it was perspective. looking outside of my own situation and understanding how to use perspective in my daily life from there on out. It became very important. And another big thing aside from the perspective was really learning to trust my intuition and pay attention to how I felt inside. Because of all of the fear and everything involved with COVID and how that affected my anxiety, I really had to kind of try to shut all that off and pay attention to what I felt was real and trust that. I became more trusting of myself. And fast forwarding into 2021, this became a year of self-expression and really finding the importance in that. Not just through painting, this time more through how I present myself to the outside world, starting to find my own fashion, my own style, my own unique style, and being comfortable with that. I went through another difficult breakup in the middle of summer that really forced me to go within myself again and figure out what I really wanted and who I am, boundaries I would have, really focusing on my strengths and realizing that I didn't need to focus on finding another partner. I needed to focus on myself in order for me to attract the right person into my life. In order for me to find her, I needed to become who I truly am. Like attracts like. I'm a firm believer in that. And I had to do another self-evaluation, and I realized one of the biggest things that needed improvement was my communication. I had learned that, or I've heard that from people in the past, and I always thought that communication was my strength until I learned that there's two parts to communication. Not just you telling people how you feel, but also listening. And embarrassingly enough, that is not one of my strengths. It has become something that's not a weakness anymore. I definitely think I've gotten much better as far as a listener is concerned, and learned a lot about communication through my podcast. That year, it was about me just recognizing it and paying attention in conversations. It also, after that breakup, I needed to start socializing more. I wasn't exactly sure of what my style was, so I was kind of battling with that at the same time. And that's when I started to realize I wanted to put myself out there, that I wanted to create a blog. I was being told in like readings, and people had mentioned to me before about doing a podcast, and that absolutely was not an option. I couldn't stand listening to my own voice when I watch videos of myself. I felt very embarrassed, but now I realize that that was because I wasn't comfortable with myself. I didn't like who I was. Now that I like who I am, I don't mind hearing my voice. So the blog, that's where the development of that began towards the end of the year. And that would turn into eventually this podcast. Going into 2022, this would be the year of vulnerability. This would really be the year I'm putting myself out there in a blog. I had started to pay attention and learn about social media the prior year in 2021. Forgot to mention that, but I really started to put myself out there on social media, or on Instagram at least, and through stories, putting my face out there and taking selfies and things that were extremely awkward for me. Then developing the podcast. It was just the next step, something that I absolutely feared doing. As the year went on, I could see even Immediately after releasing the first episode, of writing it, recording it, editing it, putting it out there, every one of those steps, it was kind of like it made me lighter. I felt better, more confident. I guess I was just developing confidence that I was brave enough to be able to even do this thing that terrified me. And as every episode was released, more and more I became more confident. And now as I look back, I'm so much of a different person. I'm a lot more comfortable with my vulnerability because I'm comfortable with who I am. That really, along with the vulnerability, became another theme of the year, but more something that I was starting to really dive into was the self-love part. Truly loving myself for who I am. All of the different parts of me. Being okay with having all of these different parts that make up this complex, weird individual. That in turn started making me, somewhere in there, really focusing on my health. And I guess it's from the COVID year really is where it started, but I really wanted to pay attention to my vitamin intake and different ways to naturally and self-sufficiently be able to provide for my body and see what the difference between taking things naturally that were actually healthy for me as opposed to all this shitty processed food, taking some of that stuff out of there, experimenting with food, seeing what works with my body, what doesn't work with my body. I have a back injury from a herniated disc that I have from back when in my younger 20s or early 20s, and that's something I've battled for a long time. Inflammation is a big deal. So I learned a lot about turmeric and other anti-inflammatories, and that just opened up more and more doors for me. And so I began to experiment with different teas and herbs and made my own fire cider, which my family and I call booty juice, because it's amazing for your guts and for your immune system. I have been taking it 2 to 3 shots every week at least since, fall. And I just love it. I knock on wood, I haven't gotten sick. Every time, there's like 2 times that I've had some signs. The one time everybody around me was sick and I didn't get sick. I also attribute that to the different types of teas I drink. I like to drink a lot of different elderberry teas and turmeric teas to help with the inflammation and adding to my immune system. But these are all things that I really started to focus on, and I'm very proud going into this year having all of these tools to take care of myself better, which physically, obviously, if you're taking care of yourself physically, it adds to the mental and it adds to the emotional. And I'm finally putting this all together and not just focusing on the mental or the emotional that I did for years because of all the healing that I had to do there. It was just so much energy that was pumped into all of that. And when you look at all of these accomplishments I have, things that I've overcame, this growth that I've had over all these years, it doesn't necessarily have to be that way for everyone. I just had a very troubled background and had gotten off of my path so much that there had to be some kind of shakeup, a dramatic shakeup. And I asked for it. I wanted it because I wanted to be happy as soon as possible. And energetically, I don't think our bodies, our human bodies can handle, we'd have some kind of traumatic response if we had to change so quickly. So it has to be a gradual thing. Now, when I look back on all of these years, it's so much work and so much pride going into it now, and having confidence, which has turned into a love for myself that I've never had before, and really just enjoying that confidence for the first time. 8 years ago, I thought I was a confident person, and but my definition of confidence has changed completely because I'm really able to be myself now. And I'm not pretending that the person that I put out to the world in order to protect myself emotionally and mentally, or primarily emotionally, that's not the real person. That I want to be the person that I am inside, outside. Also, I hope to obviously continue to develop this podcast. And I have this new project that I'm working on that I don't know how long it's going to take, but now that I've got this podcast rolling again, I feel like this was a big part of this project, and I feel like the project's going to now fall into place as it should. So, thank you for listening. I appreciate you. Please like, comment, share the podcast. Message me with any questions or thoughts. It helps so much when people interact just by letting me know what you think of each episode, even if it's just a direct message or an email or whatever. It means a lot. It keeps me going. It's kind of weird to be able to throw out your life story and it's crickets. You don't know what anybody's thinking. So it is always nice to hear what you get out of it or what you're thinking. Again, I appreciate you, and see you in the next episode. If you'd like to learn more about me and my experiences, follow @AwakenHardest on Instagram or visit the website awakenhardest.com.